On her wedding night in 1389, Queen Isabella of Valois committed an act so depraved that it would be whispered about in European courts for centuries. What happened in the royal chambers that night would redefine the very meaning of royal corruption. The wedding of Queen Isabella to King Richard II was attended by the greatest nobles of England and France. None of them suspected that the innocent 16-year-old bride was about to orchestrate the most shocking wedding night in royal history. Among the wedding guests were 100 of Europe's most powerful men, dukes, counts, bishops and knights. They had come to celebrate a political alliance. Instead, they would become unwilling participants in an act that challenged every law of God and nature. Isabella was no ordinary medieval bride. Raised in the corrupt court of France, she had been educated in arts that no Christian woman should know. Her tutors had prepared her not just for queenship, but for acts that would make the devil himself recoil in horror. The French court of Charles VI was a cesspool of corruption where young nobles were trained in perversions that dated back to the darkest days of Rome. Isabella had been chosen as Richard's bride, not for her beauty or virtue, but for her willingness to embrace the unthinkable. Hidden within the marriage contract were clauses that the English negotiators never saw. Agreements that gave Isabella unprecedented power over the wedding celebrations and the right to conduct the marriage festivities according to French custom. No one understood what this truly meant. Richard II was everything Isabella's French handlers had hoped for. A weak king more interested in poetry than politics, easily manipulated by a strong-willed woman. His courtiers worried about his ability to rule England. They had no idea he couldn't even control his own wife. The wedding feast lasted 7 hours and featured delicacies from across Europe. Wine flowed freely, lowering inhibitions and clouding judgment. Isabella watched every guest carefully, making mental notes of those who would serve. Her purposes when darkness fell, Isabella's. French ladies-in-waiting were not ordinary court attendants. They were trained in the same dark arts as their mistress. Each carried knowledge of techniques and rituals that would have horrified English courtiers. They were accomplices in corruption, not servants. While the wedding feast continued, Isabella's agents were secretly preparing chambers that no English castle had ever contained. Furniture was arranged, supplies gathered, and accommodations made for activities that violated every principle of Christian marriage. As the evening progressed, Richard began to notice disturbing signs. Isabella spoke in whispers with certain male guests, made cryptic references to completing the alliance, and displayed knowledge of subjects no virgin bride should understand. But by then, it was far too late to stop what had been set in motion. Modern analysis of court record suggests that Isabella's accomplices added substances to the wine that lowered inhibitions and enhanced certain physical responses. The 100 most powerful men in the room were being systematically prepared for participation in acts they would never have considered while sober. Isabella moved through the feast like a predator selecting prey. Her choices weren't random. Each man had been evaluated for specific physical characteristics, political usefulness and moral flexibility. She was assembling participants for a ritual that would bind them to her through shared corruption. As midnight approached, selected guests began receiving messages written in Isabella's own hand. Each invitation was different, but all contained the same essential element, a royal command that could not be disobeyed, no matter how disturbing the request might seem. The chamber Isabella had prepared was a masterpiece of corruption, disguised as luxury. Persian rugs covered stone floors, silk hangings created intimate spaces, and specialized furniture provided support for activities that no Christian architect had ever imagined. The first, guests arrived expecting a private audience with the new queen. Instead, they found themselves in a chamber that challenged their understanding of royal protocol. The wine had done its work. Their judgment was impaired, their inhibitions lowered, their resistance diminished. When Isabella emerged from behind silk curtains, She was no longer the innocent bride who had walked down the cathedral aisle. Her clothing, her posture, her very essence had transformed into something that combined royal authority with predatory sexuality. Isabella's explanation was a masterpiece of corrupted logic. She claimed that true alliance between England and France required more than political marriage. It required physical and spiritual bonding between the French queen and English nobility. Royal authority was being used to justify the unjustifiable. Several nobles attempted to leave, but Isabella's royal commands and the effects of the drugged wine created a perfect trap. Those who tried to resist found themselves as paralyzed by a combination of royal authority, social pressure, and chemical manipulation. Lord William de Montfort was the first to succumb to Isabella's demands. As one of Richard's most trusted advisors, his participation legitimized what followed. The corruption had begun, and each subsequent act would become easier as moral boundaries dissolved. What followed was not spontaneous debauchery, but systematically orchestrated corruption. Isabella had planned every detail: the order of participation, the duration of each encounter, the psychological techniques needed to ensure compliance from men who would never have imagined such acts. Those not actively participating were forced to witness every act, creating a web of shared complicity that ensured silence. Isabella understood that shared knowledge of corruption creates more powerful bonds than simple blackmail. These men were now bound to her by their own guilt. As the night progressed, Isabella's demands became more extreme. Each act pushed the boundaries further, testing how far royal authority could compel noble compliance. The 100 most powerful men in England were being systematically corrupted and controlled. When dawn finally broke, the 100 participants faced a terrible realization. They had become accomplices in acts that violated every principle of Christian civilization. Isabella had achieved something unprecedented: the systematic corruption of an entire national leadership in a single night. The morning after Isabella's wedding night, an unnatural silence fell over the English court. The 100 most powerful men in the kingdom moved like ghosts through the castle corridors, unable to meet each other's eyes, bound together by shame too deep for words. When Richard finally learned what had transpired, witnesses reported that he wept like a child for 3 hours. The king who was meant to consummate his marriage had instead been cuckolded by his own bride with the entire English nobility. His authority was shattered beyond repair. Isabella's behavior the morning after showed no shame or regret. Court observers noted that she moved with newfound confidence, giving orders to English nobles who now dared not refuse her. In one night, she had transformed from foreign bride to absolute ruler. Within hours, the participants had formed an unspoken conspiracy of silence. Each man understood that revealing the truth would destroy not just himself, but the entire foundation of English nobility. They were trapped by their own corruption. Isabella discovered that sexual humiliation created more reliable political control than any traditional alliance. The nobles who had participated in her wedding night now voted according to her wishes, supported her policies, and defended her interests. Corruption had become her greatest weapon. News of Isabella's success reached the French court within weeks. King Charles VI reportedly declared that his daughter had achieved through corruption what armies had failed to accomplish: the complete subjugation of English nobility to French interests. Of the 100 participants, 12 suffered complete psychological collapse within a month. Lord Geoffrey de Clare was found in his chambers, repeatedly washing his hands and claiming he could never be clean again. Others developed what court physicians called melancholia of the soul. The wives and families of participants soon detected the change in their husband's behavior. Lady Margaret de Montfort wrote, "My husband returned from the wedding, a different man, haunted, broken, unable to look upon his own children without weeping." Marriages began collapsing across the nobility. Isabella established regular private audiences with her wedding night participants, ensuring their continued loyalty through constant reminders of their shared corruption. These meetings became a form of ongoing psychological torture disguised as royal protocol. The English church faced an unprecedented crisis. How could they condemn adultery and fornication when the Queen had corrupted their most important noble patrons? Archbishop Thomas Arundel wrote, "The devil himself sits upon England's throne, wearing a woman's face. Several participants attempted religious confession, but found themselves unable to speak the words describing their actions." Father Benedict of St. Albans reported, "They kneel before God but cannot voice their sins. The corruption runs too deep for human absolution." Word of Isabella's wedding night spread throughout European courts, creating a diplomatic crisis for England. The Holy Roman Emperor declared England a nation ruled by Jezebel, while the Pope privately questioned whether English nobility could be considered. Christian Isabella's success inspired imitation across Europe. Queen Margaret of Denmark attempted a similar wedding night spectacle, while reports emerged of French noblewomen using sexual corruption to control their husbands' political loyalties. The technique was spreading like a plague. England's international trade began suffering as foreign merchants refused to conduct business with a nation they considered morally polluted. Venetian traders reported, "We cannot profit from commerce with a people whose souls have been sold to Satan through their queen." England's military effectiveness collapsed as commanders found their authority questioned by soldiers who had heard rumors of their leaders' wedding night humiliation. How could men who had been sexually dominated by a foreign queen command respect on the battlefield? The question of succession became nightmarishly complex. If Isabella bore children, who would be the father? The 100 nobles who had participated in her wedding night made any future heir's paternity impossible to determine. The royal bloodline had been irrevocably corrupted. News of the nobility's corruption eventually reached the common people, triggering uprisings across England. Peasants demanded the removal of lords they considered defiled by foreign witchcraft. The social order was collapsing under the weight of moral scandal. When Isabella announced her pregnancy, 3 months after the wedding, the English court faced its greatest crisis. With 100 potential fathers, the child's legitimacy was impossible to establish. Isabella had created a succession crisis that threatened the monarchy itself. French advisors began arriving at the English court, effectively governing through Isabella's control over the corrupted nobility. England was being ruled by foreign interests, conquered not through military might, but through sexual corruption of its leadership class. A small group of English nobles who had not attended the wedding began organizing resistance to Isabella's rule. Led by Henry Bolingbroke, they called themselves the Pure and declared their intention to restore England's moral integrity through force if necessary. Isabella maintained meticulous records of each participant's specific actions during her wedding night, creating a blackmail archive that ensured perpetual control. Her French scribes documented every detail, making resistance impossible for any corrupted noble. The psychological toll continued mounting as more participants chose death over continued humiliation. Lord Edmund Mortimer left a final letter stating, "Death is preferable to life as a puppet of corruption. May God forgive what I cannot forgive in myself." By 1391, European powers were discussing military intervention to remove what they called the Whore of Babylon from England's throne. The Pope secretly authorized a crusade to restore Christian governance to a nation that had fallen under demonic influence. Within 2 years of her wedding night, Isabella had achieved complete transformation of English governance. A foreign queen ruled through sexual blackmail. The nobility served foreign interests, and England had become a cautionary tale about the political power of corruption. The kingdom had crossed a point of no return. In the depths of Rievaulx Abbey, Henry Bolingbroke assembled the only English nobles who remained uncorrupted by Isabella's wedding night. These 12 men called themselves the Pure and swore a sacred oath to restore England's moral integrity, no matter the cost in blood. The pure established an intelligence network using monastery connections and loyal servants who had witnessed Isabella's continuing corruption. Brother Thomas of York reported, "The Queen's depravity grows daily. What began as political control has become systematic. Destruction of every moral boundary." Isabella's appetite for corruption expanded beyond her wedding night conquest. Monthly gatherings became weekly, then daily. She began forcing participants into acts that violated not just Christian morality, but the basic boundaries between human and animal behavior. Isabella established recruitment protocols for expanding her corruption network. Young nobles coming of age were initiated into court service through participation in her activities. Foreign ambassadors found diplomatic access dependent on their willingness to submit to her demands. Perhaps most horrifying was Isabella's systematic corruption of noble children. Starting at age 12, they were gradually exposed to her activities, ensuring that the next generation of English leadership would be morally compromised from youth. She was creating a permanently corrupted ruling class. Pope Boniface 9 dispatched secret investigators to document Isabella's activities. Their reports were so disturbing that the Pope reportedly locked himself in prayer for 3 days after reading them. Cardinal Albornoz wrote, "We have documented acts that challenge the very definition of human nature." France continued supporting Isabella's rule by sending specialists trained in advanced corruption techniques. These agents brought knowledge of practices from the most depraved courts of Europe, ensuring that Isabella's methods remained ahead of any resistance efforts. Isabella leveraged her sexual blackmail network to redirect England's wealth to France. Corrupted nobles voted for taxes that funded French military campaigns, trade agreements that favored French merchants, and territorial concessions that weakened English power. England's military secrets flowed to France through Isabella's corrupted nobles. Fortification plans, troop movements, and strategic reserves became known to French intelligence. Sexual corruption had become the ultimate espionage tool. Pure launched their first operation by rescuing 12 noble children from Isabella's corruption network. The battle at Kenilworth Castle lasted 3 days as Bolingbroke's forces fought to save England's future from systematic moral destruction. Isabella's retaliation was swift and merciless. Families of resistance members were subjected to public humiliation and forced participation in her activities. She had discovered that threatening loved ones with corruption was more effective than threatening them with death. When resistance forces captured Isabella's personal chambers, they discovered thousands of documents detailing every act of corruption. These records, written in French code, revealed that Isabella's activities were part of a systematic plan to destroy English moral authority permanently. The captured documents revealed that Isabella's methods were being replicated across Europe. Queens in Denmark, Bavaria, and Castile had adopted her techniques, creating an international network of rulers who governed through sexual corruption and blackmail. When details of Isabella's corruption network became public, England erupted in the largest popular uprising since the Peasants' Revolt. Citizens demanded the execution of every corrupted noble and the complete purification of English governance through fire and sword. English monasteries became centers of resistance, providing sanctuary to nobles attempting to escape Isabella's network. Abbot William of St. Albans declared, "These walls protect not just bodies, but souls threatened with eternal damnation through forced corruption." Isabella's corruption had evolved beyond human participants. By 1393, her activities included animals, creating scenes that violated every natural law. Dr. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote, "The Queen has crossed boundaries that separate humanity from beasts, creating abominations that offend both God and nature." Court physicians documented births that challenged understanding of human reproduction. These offspring exhibited characteristics that suggested parentage beyond normal human genetics. Isabella had created something unprecedented: children whose very existence violated natural law. France deployed military forces to protect Isabella's regime, disguising invasion as royal protection. English soil was now occupied by foreign troops, whose mission was protecting a corruption network that had conquered England more effectively than any army. England descended into undeclared civil wars. The pure fought Isabella's corrupted network. This wasn't traditional political conflict, it was warfare between competing visions of human nature itself. The stakes were nothing less than England's soul. Pope Boniface I secretly authorized a crusade against Isabella's regime, declaring England a Christian nation fallen under demonic rule. European powers began assembling the largest military intervention since the original Crusades, united in their determination to restore moral order. Isabella's methods evolved into sophisticated psychological torture. Victims were forced to participate in acts that destroyed their self-respect, then required to recruit their own family members. She had discovered that moral corruption could break human spirits more effectively than physical torture. Witnesses reported supernatural phenomena surrounding Isabella's activities. Strange lights appeared in the sky above her chambers. Animals fled the castle grounds, and religious artifacts reportedly wept blood. Even nature seemed to be rejecting the violation occurring within the royal walls. In desperation, 47 corrupted nobles attempted mass confession at Canterbury Cathedral, seeking divine forgiveness for their participation in Isabella's activities. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer wrote, "Their sins are so numerous and unnatural that human absolution seems insufficient." By 1394, Isabella had achieved something unprecedented in European history, the systematic corruption of an entire national leadership through sexual blackmail and forced participation in acts that violated every moral boundary. She had proven that power based on shared corruption could be more absolute than any traditional authority. On March 15, 1394, Pope Boniface IX issued the bull Purificae Angliam, declaring a holy crusade against Isabella's regime. For the first time since the original Crusades, European Christianity united against an enemy within its own borders. Isabella had become the Antichrist of medieval politics, the most unlikely alliance in medieval history formed against Isabella. The Holy Roman Emperor, traditional French enemies, and English resistance forces united under papal authority. Even France's enemies agreed that Isabella's corruption threatened the very foundation of Christian civilization. Massive naval blockade isolated England from French support. Venetian, Genoese, and Hanseatic ships surrounded the English coast, preventing French reinforcements from reaching Isabella. England was cut off from its corrupted allies. Facing international intervention, Isabella intensified her corruption campaigns. She ordered mass participation events where entire noble families were forced into her activities simultaneously. Her logic was simple. If everyone was corrupted, no one could claim moral authority to oppose her. Isabella's corruption evolved beyond sexual depravity into ritual murder. Noble children who resisted her network were sacrificed in ceremonies that combined French occult practices with systematic terror. She had discovered that murder enhanced the psychological control over survivors. The largest European army since Charlemagne assembled in Normandy under papal banners, 200,000. Crusaders prepared to invade England, not to conquer territory, but to save souls. This was holy war against corruption incarnate. As news of the approaching crusade spread, English commoners erupted in violent rebellion against their corrupted leaders. Peasants armed with farm tools and religious conviction attacked manor houses, crying death to the defiled. But the social order was collapsing from within. English monasteries transformed into military fortresses as monks took up arms alongside Bolingbroke's knights. Abbot Geoffrey of York declared, "We fight not for earthly power, but for the salvation of England's soul. God wills it." The church militant had returned. Desperate witnesses reported Isabella conducting rituals that seemed designed to summon demonic assistance. Court physician Dr. Malcolm wrote, "The Queen attempts congress with forces beyond human understanding. She has abandoned earthly corruption for supernatural alliance. With evil itself, Isabella's remaining supporters exhibited signs that suggested supernatural possession. They demonstrated impossible physical strength, spoke in unknown languages, and showed no response to pain. The corruption had evolved beyond psychology into something that challenged human nature itself." On September 29, 1394, the feast of St. Michael, the crusading army landed on English shores. As papal banners touched English soil, witnesses reported supernatural phenomena. The sky cleared, birds returned to areas they had abandoned, and the very air seemed purified. The Battle of Hastings. Field was unlike any medieval conflict. This wasn't warfare for territory or politics. It was combat between moral absolutes. Crusaders fighting for Christian purity faced defenders, whose corruption had made them something beyond human recognition. Witnesses from both sides reported supernatural intervention in the battle. Angels appeared above crusader formations, while demonic entities supported Isabella's forces. The conflict had escalated beyond human warfare into cosmic struggle between heaven and hell. Bolingbroke led the pure in the final assault on Windsor Castle, each warrior carrying weapons blessed by papal authority. Their battle cry, "Purity through fire," echoed across the battlefield as they fought to end Isabella's reign of corruption. Windsor Castle itself seemed to resist the assault through supernatural means. Walls wept blood, stones moved to block passages, and unnatural darkness surrounded the structure. The very architecture had been corrupted by the evil it housed. When crusaders finally breached the castle's defenses, they discovered underground chambers that defied description. Cardinal Alessandro, accompanying the assault, wrote, "We have found hell itself beneath an English castle. No human imagination could conceive such systematic corruption. In the deepest chambers, crusaders found creatures that were products of Isabella's unnatural activities. Despite their disturbing appearance, the crusaders attempted rescue, recognizing that these beings were victims rather than villains. Christian mercy extended even to corruption's offspring." Isabella made her final stand in the throne room, surrounded by unnatural darkness that seemed to emanate from her very presence. She faced the crusading leaders without fear, declaring, "I regret nothing. I have shown humanity its true nature, and it is beautiful in its corruption, Cardinal." Alessandro attempted formal exorcism of Isabella, but the ritual failed. The corruption had penetrated too deeply for human religious intervention. Isabella laughed throughout the ceremony, claiming, "Your God has no power over willing corruption. I chose this path freely." At the moment of Isabella's greatest defiance, divine judgment manifested as a pillar of purifying light. But unlike Catherine's destruction, Isabella's end would require human choice. Heaven demanded that mortals themselves reject the corruption she offered. The surviving corrupted nobles faced an ultimate choice: continue serving Isabella's corruption or seek redemption through supporting the crusade. This decision would determine not just England's fate, but whether corruption could be overcome through human will. In a moment that shocked both sides, the corrupted nobles abandoned Isabella en masse. Lord William de Montfort spoke for all. "We choose death in service of purity over life in slavery to corruption." Human will had chosen redemption over damnation. Abandoned by all supporters, Isabella faced the ultimate consequence of absolute corruption, complete isolation. She had discovered that power based entirely on shared guilt was inherently unstable. When people chose redemption over complicity, her authority evaporated. As Isabella's power crumbled, England began its long journey toward moral purification. The Crusaders had proven that even the most systematic corruption could be overcome. When people chose righteousness over complicity, the nation's soul could be saved, but only through conscious choice of good over evil. A tribunal of purification convened at Canterbury Cathedral with representatives from across Christian Europe. This wasn't merely a political trial. It was humanity's judgment on corruption itself. Cardinal Alessandro declared, "We judge not just a woman, but the very principle of evil made manifest." Isabella's defense shocked even hardened judges. She argued that her corruption was humanity's natural state, that civilization was merely a thin veneer over bestial desires. "I liberated these men from false morality," she declared. Their eager participation proves corruption is humanity's truth. 47 former participants testified about their experiences under Isabella's control. Lord Geoffrey de Clare spoke for all. "She didn't corrupt us through force alone, but by showing us depths of depravity we didn't know existed within ourselves. The horror is that part of us welcomed it." The physical evidence presented to the tribunal defied human comprehension. Preserved biological specimens, modified furniture for unnatural acts, and detailed records of systematic corruption painted a picture of evil that challenged medieval understanding of human depravity. Every Christian nation formally condemned Isabella's regime. The Holy Roman Emperor declared her an enemy of human nature itself, while the Pope issued a bull stating that her actions constituted war against the divine order. Europe was unanimous in its horror. The tribunal sentence was unprecedented: death by purifying fire, with all physical evidence of her corruption to be destroyed. Cardinal Alessandro explained, "Some evil is so absolute that it must be erased from human memory lest it inspire future corruption." Even facing execution, Isabella attempted to corrupt her guards and judges through seduction and offers of forbidden knowledge. Her very nature had become so thoroughly corrupted that she was incapable of any response except the spreading of moral infection. But the execution pyre was constructed as a sacred ritual of purification, built from consecrated wood and blessed by 40 bishops. It was designed not just to kill Isabella, but to spiritually cleanse England of her corruption. The entire nation would witness evil's destruction. Over 100,000 people gathered to witness Isabella's execution, the largest crowd in English history. They came not for entertainment, but for spiritual catharsis. The nation needed to see evil destroyed before it could begin healing from systematic corruption. Isabella's final speech was itself an attempt at mass corruption. She described her activities in graphic detail, claiming that the arousal of her audience proved humanity's natural depravity. Several listeners reportedly required immediate confession after her words. When torches were applied to the pyre, the wood refused to burn. For 3 hours, flames guttered and died, as if supernatural forces protected Isabella from purification. Cardinal Alessandro declared, "Hell fights to preserve its greatest servant." When human flames failed, divine fire descended from heaven itself to ignite the pyre. Witnesses reported that the flames burned with unnatural intensity, consuming not just Isabella's body, but seemingly her very essence. God himself had intervened to ensure evil's destruction. The divine flames consumed Isabella completely, leaving no trace of her physical form. Witnesses reported that the fire seemed to burn away corruption itself, purifying the very air around the execution site. Evil was being erased from the material world. At the moment of Isabella's death, spontaneous exorcism ceremonies erupted across England. Former victims reported feeling spiritual liberation as the corruption that had bound them dissolved. The nation's soul was healing through divine intervention. Following Isabella's execution, all physical evidence of her corruption was systematically destroyed. Documents, artifacts, and even architectural modifications were eliminated to prevent future inspiration from her methods. Some knowledge was deemed too dangerous to preserve. The survivors of Isabella's corruption required years of spiritual rehabilitation. Monasteries across Europe opened their doors to men whose souls had been systematically destroyed. The healing process was long and difficult. Some wounds to the spirit never fully healed. England established unprecedented constitutional safeguards against future corruption. New laws limited royal authority, required witness to private royal activities, and created religious oversight of all court functions. Never again would unchecked power enable such systematic evil. European powers created an international monitoring system to detect early signs of systematic corruption in any Christian nation. Papal observers, diplomatic intelligence, and religious networks would ensure that Isabella's methods could never again take root in civilized society. While most evidence was destroyed, limited records were secretly preserved in Vatican archives for defensive purposes. These documents, accessible only to the highest church authorities, would help future generations recognize the early signs of systematic corruption. Medieval scholars attempted to understand how Isabella had achieved such systematic corruption of the human spirit. Their studies, while primitive by modern standards, identified key psychological mechanisms that would later be recognized as fundamental to totalitarian control. The effects of Isabella's corruption extended to future generations. Children and grandchildren of victims exhibited inherited psychological traits, both trauma responses and remarkable resilience. The human spirit had proven capable of healing even from systematic corruption. Isabella's story became legendary across Europe, told as the ultimate warning against unchecked power and moral corruption. Her name became synonymous with the danger of absolute authority combined with systematic evil. The legend served as eternal vigilance against corruption. Isabella's methods find disturbing parallels in modern history. Systematic corruption, used as political control, sexual blackmail as governance tool, and the gradual normalization of moral boundaries. Her techniques remain relevant because human nature itself remains unchanged. Isabella of Valois proved that systematic corruption could destroy even the strongest civilization from within. Her legacy reminds us that moral boundaries require constant vigilance, that power without accountability inevitably corrupts, and that the price of civilization is eternal. Watchfulness against our own darkest impulses. In the decades following Isabella's execution, European chroniclers systematically altered historical records to hide the full extent of her corruption. What you've heard tonight is the truth they tried to erase, a story deemed too dangerous for medieval minds to fully comprehend. In 1989, renovation work at Canterbury Cathedral revealed hidden chambers containing documents that medieval authorities had sealed away. These papers, preserved for 600 years, contained the complete testimony of Isabella's tribunal, testimony that challenged everything historians thought they knew about medieval corruption. Modern psychologists who have studied the recovered documents identify Isabella's methods as early examples of what we now call systematic psychological warfare. Dr. Sarah Chen of Oxford notes, Isabella pioneered techniques that wouldn't be formally understood until the 20th century study of totalitarian control. Computer analysis has identified disturbing parallels between Isabella's methods and modern political corruption scandals. The use of sexual compromise for political control, systematic blackmail networks, and gradual normalization of moral transgression appear. Repeatedly throughout history, attempts to study Isabella's methods face systematic academic resistance. Professor Michael Hartwell was denied tenure at Cambridge for publishing research on medieval systematic corruption. Academic institutions seem determined to keep these historical lessons hidden from public understanding. Intelligence agencies have shown disturbing interest in Isabella's methods. Declassified documents reveal that both CIA and KGB studied her techniques during the Cold War. The systematic corruption of leadership through sexual compromise remains a relevant intelligence tool. Digital technology has amplified the potential for Isabella's style. Corruption beyond anything she could have imagined. Modern surveillance, digital evidence, and global communication networks make systematic sexual blackmail more feasible than ever in human history. Contemporary scandals involving powerful figures and sexual corruption often follow patterns identical to Isabella's methods. The systematic use of sexual compromise to maintain Political control appears in every era, suggesting these techniques exploit fundamental human vulnerabilities. Isabella's story reveals that no institution is immune to systematic corruption when power lacks accountability. Modern governments, corporations, and religious organizations remain vulnerable to the same techniques she pioneered 6 centuries ago. Isabella's historical example provides clear warning, signs of systematic corruption, secretive leadership, gradual erosion of moral boundaries, resistance to accountability, and the normalization of previously unthinkable behaviors. These patterns repeat across cultures and centuries. The resistance methods that defeated Isabella remain relevant today. Transparency, moral courage, international cooperation, and the willingness to choose principle over personal safety. These timeless tools can defeat corruption in any era. Psychologists warn that detailed knowledge of systematic corruption techniques can create moral contagion. The dangerous idea that such behavior is normal or acceptable. This is why societies consistently suppress the full truth about figures like Isabella. Modern media manipulation often follows Isabella's playbook: gradual normalization of transgression, celebrity endorsement of moral flexibility, and the systematic erosion of traditional boundaries. The techniques she pioneered operate on global scale today. Every generation faces Isabella's choice: accept systematic corruption as normal or maintain the moral courage to resist. The stakes remain identical: the preservation of human dignity versus the convenience of moral compromise. Isabella's legacy places unique responsibility on each generation to teach moral boundaries to their children. The corruption she represented can only be defeated through consistent education about the difference between right and wrong. Power and service are the constitutional safeguards created after Isabella's reign. Separation of powers, oversight mechanisms, transparency requirements remain our primary defense against systematic corruption. These protections must be constantly maintained and strengthened. Isabella's story teaches that vigilance against corruption is not a one-time effort, but an eternal responsibility. Each generation must actively choose moral boundaries over convenient compromise. The price of civilization is constant moral courage, Queen Isabella of Valois discovered that systematic sexual corruption could control the most powerful people in medieval society. Her methods work just as effectively today, because human psychology hasn't changed. Remember her story not as ancient history, but as eternal warning. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and corruption shared becomes corruption normalized. Guard your souls accordingly, for in every age, Isabella's shadow waits to fall across those who forget that some boundaries must never be crossed.